Good morning on this Saturday morning. My phone had to reconnect, so hopefully we don't have connection problems here this morning. But today we're going to look at Galatians chapter 2 through chapter 3, verse 15. Tomorrow's reading, being Sunday, is Galatians 3, so we're going to look at about half of that today in addition to Galatians 2. I'll be live for worship at 9 o'clock from Mabel and Sutton tomorrow, and also in person at 10:30 at Our Savior's in McHenry. If you care to join us for either of those, in person or definitely online on Facebook Live, appreciate that. Anyway, in today's readings in chapter 2. Paul starts out. He says, "Then after 14 years, I went again to Jerusalem." So he'd gone to Jerusalem, 3 years after his conversion on the road to Damascus, and had met with Peter and James and John and the other disciples that were there, and then again went on missionary journeys, and 14 years later returned again, in verse 7, it says that when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted for the gospel for the circumcised. So Paul is known as the missionary, the apostle to the Gentiles, the uncircumcised. And Peter continued to do most of his leadership within the Jewish community, the circumcised community, because circumcision was a Jewish tradition. Not so much of the Gentiles at all. And it was, one of the sticky points, for a lot of the Jews that, the Gentiles couldn't be real believers if they didn't have themselves circumcised, if they didn't, get in accordance with all of this. And so there was a lot of discussion about that, but I guess that, that's just to go back up into verse 6, Paul writes, God indeed shows no partiality. He says, from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, they actually makes no difference. And he says, God shows no partiality. And this is so true. It's such a thing we have to remember that, we can't really distinguish ourselves as really better or worse than anyone else, because we're all sinners. We're all human. We're all flesh and blood. And we are all in need of God's grace and mercy. And so in chapter 2, it talks a lot about, how, the disciples in Jerusalem acknowledged Paul's apostleship and the teaching that he was doing in these missionary journeys that he was going to. And verse 10 says, they asked only one thing of me, that we remember the poor, which was actually what I was eager to do. Remember reading in Corinthians about, Paul had mentioned the offerings that were taken, to bring back to like Jerusalem or to help other people, and how he commended different people, for their generosity and for their giving. And then in verse 11 we find a little bit of trouble within the church, because Paul rebukes Peter. Peter had division with all of these different animals and stuff coming down, and rise up and eat, for what I have made clean is not unclean. And so Peter had really taken on a lot of the Gentile customs and traditions, and was, living more that way, and maybe not paying attention to some things that he was doing. I mean, you can read a little bit about it, but he says, Paul writes, but I saw they were not acting consistently with the gospel. And he says, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like a Jew? Because Paul was saying that, Peter had his vision and was living like a Gentile, but yet telling these Gentiles that they had to take on all of the Jewish traditions and rites and rituals and stuff. And Paul calls him on that. And, I think we've all come to points in our life when, somebody points out something that we're, maybe being two-faced about, or you say one thing and do another. And this is, one of the things that we are reminded of, that we are to walk the walk, not just talk the talk, that we are to live what we preach, and that we are to be, who we should be as best as we can, and true to the gospel of Jesus Christ that way. And then in verse 15, 16, Paul says, we ourselves are Jews by birth, not Gentile sinners. I mean, so here's that discrepancy again. We're Jews, we're not Gentile sinners. I mean, the Jews are sinners too, plain and simple fact. But then he goes on, yet we know that a person is justified not by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And then he goes on, but no one will be justified by the works of the law. In our effort to be justified in Christ, we have been found, and we're not living that life out. He says that, we need to be living a life that reflects this, that we're saved by faith through grace, because we can't live the law perfectly. I mean, I've commented a couple times on this student First Communion one time. It said, if I haven't sinned since I had communion last, do I need communion again? Well, we are all sinners. Jews, Gentiles, Romans, Greeks, Norwegians, Germans, it doesn't make any difference. There is no distinction that way, because none of us can be justified by the law. Verse 19 and through there, a couple, there's some pretty familiar verses, at least to me. For through the law I died to the law, so I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God. And then in verse 21, he says, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if justification comes through the law, then Christ died for nothing. Think about that. If we can justify ourselves, if we can have this right relationship with God by fulfilling the law, then Jesus died for nothing. But I think that we will all agree that none of us can be justified by the law, live that perfect life. In verse 3, or chapter 3, it starts out, you foolish Galatians. I mean, we don't like to be called fools. We don't like to have the error of our ways pointed out. But he says, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Who has gotten you to believe this false gospel? Who has gotten, into your mind and twisted things around? And he says, this is what I want to know. Did you receive the Spirit by doing works of the law, or by believing what you heard? And then he goes on and he talks, starting in verse 6, just as Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. It was, Abraham was reckoned as righteousness because of his faith in God, because of his belief in God. And that goes back, that's from Genesis 15, that, Abraham was justified, made righteous by his faith, not by his actions, but by his faith in God. And this was right after he had gone up the mountain to sacrifice his son, his only son. And this is a reminder that God did sacrifice his son for you and for me and for all people that way. And so, it says that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, just as the Jews had been justified by faith, by believing, by trusting. It's not by works. It is, good works are our thankful response to this free grace, this forgiveness, this acceptance that we have through God. Verse 10, Paul writes, for all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not observe and obey all things written in the book of the law. So if you break one law, one little bitty law, you're guilty of all. Just one little sin, you're guilty. You're not worthy of God. And I'm pretty sure I know that we have all made that one sin. Verse 11 again in chapter 3, it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the one who is righteous will live by faith. And then the last thing that we're going to look at today, verses 13 and 14, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, in order that Jesus Christ himself might receive the blessing of Abraham, so that blessing will come to the Gentiles, so that we, you and me, might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. That's why Christ died on the cross, so that we can receive the Spirit by faith, by trust, by believing that this ultimate sacrifice he did was for us and for our salvation. And that through Jesus' death on the cross, we are forgiven. We are made right with God. So you and me, we are righteous by our faith.